There's a principle. I can't think of the exact name of it. There's a buzzword for it, there's an actual name for it. But it has to do with the relationship between nations. Nations that are dominant and nations that are trying to get to the point of, let's say, being at par. And the nations that are dominant don't necessarily like the fact that the nations are trying to get to par. This creates a conflict between these two nations and makes conflict, if not necessarily inevitable, likely. China has been preparing for this eventuality. Russia has been preparing for this eventuality. The United States has taken a policy that it will not have any other nation to be able to challenge it, like the Soviet Union. This also means, however, that the United States is positioned at war with the rest of the world, seeing as we no longer have a unipolar world. The sooner the United States realizes it, the better for the rest of the world. The problem is the United States has not realized that and doesn't look like it's in realizing it anytime soon. The One of the nearest competitors, especially from the standpoint of economic might, even though it has a different philosophy with regards to this kind of interventionist policies, is China. It is three times our population, and it will be, despite what Joe Biden say, a dominant economic force around the world. I'm asking George Galloway about this very question. This notion of China rising as a world power, and what does that mean from the standpoint of the positioning between the United States and China? Understand, I'm not asking this question from the standpoint of saying China doesn't have all the agency, or from a universal standpoint, has all the agency in as much as the United States to excel and expand and everything else. This is not a value judgment. This is more so asking, what does he expect? If he was sitting on the moon looking at the planet and he wasn't necessarily taking a side, he wasn't necessarily feeling any particular way from a moral standpoint, he was just saying, what takes place in regards to one country trying to expand and the other country not wanting that country to expand and trying to corral the economic might, especially looking at it from the standpoint of Germany and Britain, the country to which he finds residence. Let's take a listen to Galloway. This was one of the most interesting questions because he takes this question of on the moon looking at the stars and takes it to a whole nother level that could almost be a black box episode in and of itself. But listen to his explanation of this. This is going to be a video by itself because this was somewhat of a long answer, but it's a good one. No further ado, Mr. George Galloway. You mentioned the United States showering money. Essentially, European Union, NATO, those things were kind of a bulwark against the Soviet Union that was screaming that we're socialists, we're there was a certain propaganda associated with communism and capitalism. The Soviet Union took that on themselves a certain degree, saying, "Hey, we are a socialist country. We take care of our people, etc." And NATO, let's say European Union was kind of a pushback against that. Is China doing something similar with the Belt and Road Initiative? This is going somewhat of a tangent, but in bringing in the European Union and the reason for it, this kind of comes in the face of what China is doing with Belt and Road. Is that fair?
It's a good question. I think it's, I'll answer it with a joke. When in the 1970s, when the legendary Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai was asked what he thought were the long-term implications of the French Revolution, which had occurred 200 years previously, he took a draw on his cigarette and he said, "It's far too early to say." So my answer to your question is, it's far too early to say. On the face of it, China is not an imperialist power.
No,
It is seeking to unite the world as trading partners. It doesn't interfere in other people's politics. It has friendly relations with countries with politics diametrically opposed to theirs.
Yes.
And so far, there have been no problems with that. But there are understandable anxieties, particularly in Africa, for example, that Chinese investment in Africa and involvement in the economies of Africa, at least possibly, potentially, open China to the charge of a new colonialism. would,
Yes.
of course, be as unacceptable as the old colonialism. So we must avoid, and so far the Chinese have entirely avoided it, I must stress that we don't see colonialism with Chinese characteristics coming to the fore. And so the Belt and Road Initiative, I wholly support. I commend it. It's providing vital infrastructure and connectivity for many parts of the world, Pakistan, for example, that are greatly to the advantage of Pakistan and its people. And I believe it will benefit everyone uh, that it touches and
You
that
know,
gets involved in it.
one of the funniest things that I saw the other day was the IMF or people for the IMF saying the Belt and Road Initiative is a boondoggle, and you guys are going to be put into debt that you can't get out of. I love the fact that the IMF was the one that was saying it.
Yeah,
It's like, how dare you guys take money from somebody else that you know can afford to pay back?
yeah,
Last question. Yesterday, well, this is the last question with this part A and point B. And by the way, I don't. Again, I'm agnostic with the Belt and Road. I look at this stuff purely from a political angle and think,
yeah.
what is the objectives of the people involved? I suspect China wants to get a certain level of political influence in the various countries by investing capital in those countries.
China's entitled to
Absolutely. Yeah,
exactly the political weight that its population, its culture, its economy deserve. Uh,
agreed.
the the new order will have to take account of the fact that China is now, and certainly very soon, unarguably will be, the most important country in the world. It's hard for Americans to get their head around that, but that's the reality. China's vast population, its gigantic economy, its huge military strength, its cultural soft power, its diplomacy. China must be treated with respect, due respect, and given the respect that its weight deserves.
I
And that
agree.
day is coming. The day is coming when nothing will happen in the world without China's agreement to it. And
Yeah.
countries in the fading, failing old world really have to get used to that.
Three things. God, man, I could talk to you for hours, but I'll keep it to three things. When I think one thing we saw when the airplanes were brought down, Boeing essentially trying to find ways to deal with Airbus and pushes out a program to maximize their profit for competition, and that plane ended up going down. Boeing not necessarily being the most honest about the fact that they had a software update, that type of stuff. Um, China bought down those planes first. China essentially came out and said, we're downing the planes. And the rest of the world went along with it, with the United States being the last one. I think we're seeing a turn of the worm in this case, to some degree, to what you're saying about this.
Well,
Assume for the. Okay.
Jamal, I'll give you an amusing example. During the Syria crisis in 2013, there's been a long crisis, but the one in 2013, when the British government brought to the House of Commons and were defeated.
Yes, I remember that under Cameron. Yeah.
Yeah, I spoke in that debate, if I may say so. It's a speech worth watching on YouTube. We were, the whole House of Commons was upside down in a state of turmoil. Public reaction from outside was enormous. And I went to a briefing as a member of Parliament with a foreign affairs specialism. And the then British foreign minister told the following story. And he told it because he thought it reflected badly on China. The truth is the opposite. He said that he'd been trying to get through to the Chinese foreign minister, who was refusing to take his calls. And finally, our foreign secretary said to the secretary, the assistant, the aide, to the Chinese foreign minister, look, I want to know, will China support British bombardment of Syria in any circumstances then? And this functionary answered, Mr. Hague, for it was he, William Hague, Mr. Hague, there are no circumstances in which China will support the bombing of Syria. Now, Haig told us this story as if to say how savage these Chinese. They won't even come to the phone to their former imperial master.
How dare they not support us dropping these humanitarian bombs out there? I love that. That's amazing.
What it showed was China will no longer take orders from anybody. And that will eventually become. China will not allow bad things to happen in the world, at least without its views being properly taken into account. And I myself look forward to that new order.
Okay, that leads to a question. And this is one of those, if you're sitting on the moon and you're looking at events on Earth and you're not looking at right or wrong, you're not looking at, none of the morality issues that are associated with that. What does that mean in the wider scheme of things? And think about this from the context of other countries. For example, World War One, and before World War One, where you had a buildup of forces, particularly Germany, this kind of competition between Britain and Germany in regards to ships. Doesn't this portend bad results? And by the way, this is not me saying China shouldn't do it. This is not me saying China doesn't have the right to expand to the degree that they can. None of that stuff. I'm just saying, without having any level of morality, out level of right or wrong, any of that stuff involved in it, in the way that the countries are trying to expand, the United States has taken a policy that is not going to allow another rival power, which means that the United States is always in competition with other nations, particularly rival nations. China has, 1 billion people, like 3 times the population of the United States. And you can kind of see this notion of economic might and economic clout, especially in Africa. My wife and I were in Africa last year, and we could see, there are casinos where the majority of the people who are there are Chinese, to try to get across this notion of their influence in Africa. Does this portend conflict? And I know for myself that the Chinese military has been working with the Russian military to kind of solidify themselves, because they, I think, to some degree assume that there will be a larger competition regarding the United States, and Western powers on one side, and what it looks like the Chinese, particularly from the economic standpoint, on the other.
Well, you mentioned sitting on the moon. There are trillions of planets in our universe alone. And the recent black holes discovery seems to imply there's many more universes, maybe trillions of those. So if you look at it that way, the problems we're discussing don't add up to a hill of beans, because there are far greater, almost metaphysical issues that we as a human race need to get onto. But if we stay in the prosaic conflict between 2 countries on one small planet in one of our universes, people have to get used to the fact, as the British need to, and you need a human race, this tiny planet, in just one universes. If we don't hang together, we're all going to hang separately.
Agreed.
We really can't afford conflict, especially not nuclear, existentially fatal conflict. We can't afford it. So we have to find a way to get along. And it's really not rocket science. It's not, you don't need to be Einstein to accept, intellectually at least, that we cannot have a world where one country, however exceptional it imagines itself to be,
yes,
can dictate to other countries. I did an interview. I've toured the United States on speaking tours many times. I was once interviewed by a fellow called Medvedev on a radio in Seattle, in Washington State. And he opened the show by welcoming everyone to this show on the greenest, greatest country on God's earth. And I couldn't allow this to pass. I couldn't allow it to pass, because I had to point out to him how insulting that was.
Yeah.
First of oh, my country is greener than yours. Secondly, if you are the greatest, that makes me less than you. Who decided that?
Yeah.
Was there a popular vote on that matter? Was there, a divine? Was it handed down from Mount Sinai on a stone somewhere? It's this foolish, childish imagining.
It is a bizarre perspective. Like,
Yeah,
but it is.
but it's very common in the US.
Yeah.
Even amongst nice people, they don't even necessarily. He wasn't nice; he was very nasty. But uh, even amongst people who don't necessarily want to offend or upset other people, the idea that somebody, God, uh, gave you some special role in the world is deeply insulting to everybody else. The only way we're going to survive as a human race is equity, fairness, justice, a properly fair distribution of wealth and resources with everyone cooperating for the common good of humanity. You're a
Agreed.
black man, I'm a white man. If I cut you, you cut me, we bleed the same color. Our children are asleep right now. Yours will be asleep soon. Our greatest concern in life is what kind of world our children are going to grow up in. Will
Yeah.
there be a world for them to grow up in? No human being thinks otherwise than that. And if you accept that there's only one race, the human race, then you can move towards an acceptance that there's a need for fairness and equity. I think equity is a magic word. It's one that isn't often used in political discourse. It doesn't mean equality. It doesn't mean that I should earn exactly the same amount as you, though I'm a follower of Aristotle, who argued that the richest man should be no more than 3 times as rich as the poorest man. I
Yeah.
believe in that. But equity and equality are not the same thing. We need fairness and justice. And oftentimes we seem to be headed in the opposite direction.
And that's what I'm getting at. It's like I don't think you get a world that's not chaotic without equity and justice.
Yeah.
Like I don't think people, human beings, can exist in a planet and it's unfair and it's just that way in perpetuity. I think people like I think a lot of the chaos, and this kind of goes to the yellow vest movement. Like a lot of the chaos that people are getting, even Brexit, I would argue, to some degree, is spurred on by this level of inequity or what people perceive as being a certain unfairness in
Yes, that's right. Our current political system isn't working. It isn't working for the majority, neither for the majority in your country or mine, let alone the majority in the world. And as long as that's the case, there will be no peace. We
Yeah.
have a slogan here. I think you have it there
No
too.
justice, no peace.
No justice, no peace. Again, you don't need to be Einstein to work that out. You cannot expect peace from me if you're living in a castle and I'm living on the street.
Yeah.
If your children are warm and fed and my children are not,
Yeah.
how can I accept that?
Yeah. And
What
the
kind of
wild part
man
is
would I be if I accepted that?
it's a bizarre thing. I mean, but there's a certain degree of propaganda that goes along with trying to get people to accept the unacceptable, in the society, believing that propaganda can just kind of paper over all of the stuff that's wrong. Um,
We had it,
so,
of course,
like,
when I was a child. There was a hymn I used to sing: "The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate." Uh, some organized religion have propagated this idea
yeah,
that someone, God even, how blasphemous is that, ordained that some can have all of life's luxuries and others may not. Of course, even that hymn is contradicted in other religious texts and so on. It's easier,
poor,
said the
poor
Lord,
man.
for
Yeah,
a rich man It's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven.
Heaven. Yeah.
It's a pretty socialist point of view, you know.
It is. Jesus, they're acting like Jesus was this kind of right winger. It was a hippie. I don't know how you come away from the Bible with a different context.